My name is Victoria Watson, and I am 28 years old. 3 months ago, my father sent a private email to the senior vice president of the most cutthroat mergers and acquisitions firm in New York. He knew I was interviewing there that week. He wrote to tell her that I was a good girl, but not that bright and easily overwhelmed by complex tasks. He tried to kill my career before it even started just to keep me under his thumb. He thought I would never find out. He thought I would spend my life as the invisible sister fetching coffee for my brother. He was wrong. Because the vice president did not delete his email. She printed it out, she handed it to me, and then she gave me the tools to legally dismantle my father's financial empire. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything he owned, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Eva Tells Stories, but only if this resonates with you. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. Now let me take you back to a Tuesday morning in Manhattan, 3 months into a job I was never supposed to have. I worked 80-hour weeks. I slept on a couch in the break room twice a week. I did not complain. I was a junior strategy analyst surviving on caffeine and the fear of failure. So when my desk phone rang and Sarah Caldwell summoned me to her corner office on the 60th floor, my stomach dropped. Sarah was a notoriously cold executive. People walked into her office with careers and walked out with cardboard boxes. I smoothed my blazer, prepared my defense, and walked in expecting to be fired. Sarah did not look up from her monitor right away. The view behind her showcased the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. When she finally turned to me, she did not ask me to sit. She simply slid a single piece of paper across her polished mahogany desk. "Read it," she said. I picked it up. It was an email printed from Sarah's private inbox. The sender was Richard Watson, my father. He was the managing partner of a rival boutique corporate advisory firm. My eyes scanned the text. He wrote that he noticed I was on the interview roster. He claimed he was stepping in out of paternal concern. He wrote that the corporate environment would be too demanding for me. He called me a good girl, but stated I was not that bright and easily overwhelmed by complex tasks. I stood there holding the paper. The words burned. My own father had reached out to a stranger to sabotage my independence. He wanted me to fail so I would have to rely on him. I looked up at Sarah. I expected her to tell me my performance matched his description. Instead, she leaned back in her leather chair and rested her elbows on the armrests. "I hired you because of that email," Sarah said. Her voice was steady and sharp. "I know exactly what a man like Richard Watson looks like, and I know the unparalleled hunger of a daughter he underestimates." I could not speak. The betrayal from my father was still ringing in my ears, but Sarah did not give me time to process the hurt. She tapped a thick black folder sitting on the edge of her desk. "We are initiating a highly classified hostile takeover," she continued. "I need a lead analyst who is hungry enough to work without sleeping and ruthless enough to see the math without emotions getting in the way. Prove to me that your father is wrong." I looked at the folder. Then I looked at the email in my hand. I folded the paper in half and slid it into my pocket. I did not shed a tear. I just nodded and took the folder. The battle lines were drawn. The subway ride back to my apartment in Brooklyn felt like moving through water. It was nearly midnight, and my reflection in the dark glass of the train window showed a woman running on fumes. The 80-hour work weeks at the firm had carved shadows under my eyes and drained the color from my face. I should have been exhausted. My body certainly was. But my mind was running at a frantic racing speed, fueled by the single piece of paper folded inside my coat pocket, the email from my father. The words he had written to my boss calling me easily overwhelmed and not that bright played on a continuous loop in my head. I walked the 4 blocks from the station to my building, letting the biting autumn wind hit my face. I needed the cold to keep me grounded. I needed to focus on the black folder Sarah Caldwell had handed me containing the details of the hostile takeover I was now tasked with leading. I unlocked my apartment door and tossed my keys onto the narrow kitchen counter. The apartment was silent and dark. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. I just wanted to drop my bag and process the seismic shift in my reality. Before I could even take off my coat, my cell phone rang. The harsh digital tone shattered the quiet of the apartment. I pulled the phone from my bag and stared at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed the name Richard Watson. My father. He never called me this late. He rarely called me at all unless he needed something logistical arranged or wanted to complain about the traffic on his commute from Connecticut. I stood in the dark kitchen, watching the screen illuminate the cracked tile counter. My thumb hovered over the ignore button. For a fraction of a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But the new instinct Sarah had awakened in me whispered that information was leverage. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just waited. "Victoria, are you awake?" my father said. His voice did not hold a trace of warmth or paternal concern. It was brisk and hurried, the tone he used when speaking to junior staff members or restaurant valets. He did not ask how my new job was going. He did not ask if I had eaten dinner, or if I was holding up under the brutal hours. I told him I was awake. He exhaled sharply into the receiver, the sound of a man annoyed that the world was not spinning fast enough to accommodate his schedule. "I need you to open your laptop," he ordered. "Your brother is in a bind and we are running out of time." I closed my eyes and let my head rest against the cool plaster of the kitchen wall. Preston. Of course it was about Preston. My brother was 26 years old and held the title of Senior Vice President of Acquisitions at my father's boutique advisory firm. It was a title that took brilliant analysts a decade of relentless grinding to earn. Preston had received it the day after he graduated from Cornell. I remembered his graduation party vividly. My father had rented out a rooftop venue in Manhattan and handed Preston the keys to a new Porsche along with his corporate title. When I had graduated near the top of my class from a state university, while working double shifts to cover my own tuition, my father had bought me a leather planner. He had patted my shoulder and suggested I look into administrative roles because I had a talent for filing things efficiently. The financial sector, he had told me with a sympathetic smile, was just too aggressive for my natural temperament. He had always viewed me as background radiation in the story of his legacy. "What did Preston do?" I asked. My voice was flat and devoid of the eager daughter persona I usually projected. My father clicked his tongue in frustration. "He did not do anything wrong, Victoria. He secured a preliminary meeting with a major tech client. It is a defense pitch to retain their portfolio. It is the biggest account our firm has ever seen, and the pitch is tomorrow morning at 8. The problem is the client requested a deep dive into our predictive valuation models. They want to see the raw math behind the debt-to-equity ratios." I understood the problem immediately. Preston could network in a luxury box at a sporting event. He could wear a tailored suit and parrot industry buzzwords over overpriced cocktails. But Preston could not build a financial model to save his life. He did not understand the granular mechanics of corporate valuation. If a client pushed past the glossy cover page of his pitch deck, they would find nothing but empty space. "He cannot build the models," I said. "He is a big-picture thinker," my father snapped defensively. "He manages relationships. He does not need to be bogged down in the spreadsheet trenches. That is what support staff is for. But our lead quantitative analyst caught a flight to London this afternoon and cannot be reached. Preston needs these defensive models constructed by dawn, or the client will walk. We cannot lose this account, Victoria. The firm needs this win." He paused, letting the silence stretch across the line. It was a calculated pause. The space where I was supposed to rush in and offer my services. When I remained silent, he deployed his usual tactics. "Your mother is worried sick about this," he said, lowering his voice to feign vulnerability. "She knows how much pressure your brother is under. He has barely slept. You know he struggles with anxiety when his plate gets too full. I would hate to see him crash over a technicality. Just take his outline and clean up the numbers. It will only take you a few hours. Be a good sister and help him out." I reached into my coat pocket. My fingertips traced the sharp folded edge of the printed email Sarah had given me. The paper felt heavy. My father had written to a senior executive at a predatory firm to warn her that I was incapable of handling complex tasks. He had actively tried to murder my career trajectory to ensure I remained small and manageable. Yet here he was at midnight demanding that I use my brain to salvage his kingdom. The sheer brazen hypocrisy of it stole the air from my lungs. He told the world I was incompetent, but in the dark of night, he relied on my intellect to build the foundation his golden sun would stand on. In that moment, standing in the shadows of my kitchen, the dynamic became crystalline. I saw the invisible architecture of the Watson family. I was not a daughter. I was a parasite pipeline. I was a disposable engine kept in the basement to power the glittering lights of their penthouse. They did not value me, but they needed my labor to maintain the illusion of Preston's brilliance. Every time I had helped them in the past, I had done it, hoping they would eventually see my worth and welcome me to the table. I had believed that if I just proved myself useful enough, they would finally love me. The emotional tether that had bound me to that desperate hope did not break with a loud dramatic snap. It dissolved quietly. The yearning for their approval evaporated into the cold air of the apartment, leaving nothing behind but tactical clarity. I realized I held the keys to their survival. They were asking me to build the very armor they intended to wear into battle. "Send me his outline," I said. My father let out a long breath of relief. "I knew we could count on you, Victoria. Your mother will be so relieved. You are saving your brother a lot of unnecessary stress. I will have him email you the files right now. Just make the math look bulletproof." "I will make it look perfect," I replied. My father hung up without saying thank you. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. The screen went dark. I took off my coat and hung it over the back of a dining chair. I walked over to my work bag and pulled out my laptop, setting it on the counter next to Sarah Caldwell's black folder. I opened the screen and watched the harsh white light flood the dark kitchen. I was running on 0 hours of sleep, but I did not feel tired anymore. The exhaustion had been replaced by the cold, burning adrenaline of an apex predator, realizing the prey had just willingly walked into the cage. I was going to build Preston his financial models. I was going to give him the exact tools he needed to stand in front of that tech client and claim victory. But my compliance was no longer an act of submission. It was the first move on a new chessboard. I cracked my knuckles and waited for my brother's email to arrive. The clock on my microwave read 3 in the morning. The neon sign from the bodega across the street flickered, casting long orange shadows across my cramped living room. I sat cross-legged on the bare hardwood floor, with my laptop balanced on my knees. The silence of Brooklyn at this hour was usually comforting, but tonight it felt thick and expectant. Preston had sent over his files an hour earlier. Calling his attachment a file was a very generous interpretation of the digital mess sitting on my screen. He had sent a disjointed collection of corporate buzzwords and shallow revenue projections. It was the financial equivalent of a child finger painting and expecting to sell the canvas at an elite gallery. He wanted a comprehensive defense model to retain a premier tech client, and he had given me nothing but empty jargon. I rubbed my tired eyes, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. I did not just fix his math. I orchestrated a tactical masterpiece. I remembered my college years spending Friday nights alone in the university library, deciphering complex derivatives and studying historical market crashes. While I was poring over balance sheets to maintain my scholarships, Preston was out drinking on our father's dime, failing his introductory economics courses. I knew the architecture of corporate valuation better than anyone in my bloodline because I had been forced to earn my knowledge. Preston just inherited his position. I began building the models from scratch. I designed pristine charts and beautiful cascading graphs. To a board of directors who only looked at the surface, the presentation would appear to be a work of sheer genius. It projected stability and infinite growth. It used the exact layout and color schemes that senior executives loved to see in a boardroom. But beneath the polished exterior, I planted the poison pill. I manipulated the debt-to-equity ratios, embedding deep latent miscalculations in the amortization schedules. I tied their projected revenue to a highly volatile market index disguised as a stable bond yield. If the client experienced a regular quarter, the numbers would hold up perfectly. But if the company faced any real financial stress or a targeted hostile audit, the entire model would collapse like a house of cards. It was an insurance policy, a quiet, invisible leash I could pull if my family ever tried to leverage me again. I saved the documents, attached them to an email, and hit send at 4 in the morning. I closed my laptop and finally went to sleep. 5 days later, my cell phone started buzzing relentlessly against the surface of my office desk. I ignored the vibrations until I finished my morning market analysis for Sarah. When I finally picked up the device, I saw a steady stream of notifications from the family group chat. My mother had named the chat Watson Legacy years ago, and it was usually reserved for holiday planning or photos of their country club dinners. Today, the screen was filled with capital letters and exclamation points from my brother. Preston had just finished the pitch. The client signed, he typed. They loved the strategy. I knocked it out of the park. They said it was the most robust defense model they had ever seen. My father responded less than a minute later. That is my boy. I knew you had it in you. This account secures our quarter and puts us on the map. You are a natural, Preston. My mother chimed in with a string of heart emojis, calling him the pride of the family and promising a lavish celebration dinner. I scrolled through the messages, reading every word of their mutual adoration. There was not a single mention of my name. There was no private text thanking me for the ghost-written strategy. There was no acknowledgement that I had sacrificed my sleep to save his career and secure their premier account. They had entirely erased my contribution from their reality. The old version of me, the daughter who desperately wanted to belong, would have felt a sharp sting of rejection. I would have drafted a polite but pointed reply, hoping to remind them of my existence. I would have craved their credit. But standing in the center of the bullpen at the most ruthless firm in New York, I felt nothing but a cold, detached amusement. Their arrogance was their defining flaw. They believed their own lies so thoroughly that they actually thought Preston possessed the intellect to build those models. My irritation was fleeting. I locked my phone and tossed it back into my desk drawer. I did not need their validation anymore. I was playing a different game now. My focus snapped back to my actual job when Sarah Caldwell's assistant tapped on my cubicle partition. Sarah wanted me in the main conference room immediately. I grabbed my legal pad and walked down the long corridor. The atmosphere in our office was always charged with predatory energy, but today the air felt different. It felt heavy with anticipation. I entered the conference room. It was an intimidating space enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the financial district. Sarah stood at the head of the long marble table. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and held a sleek digital presenter. Two of the senior partners were seated near the front, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Sarah motioned for me to take the empty chair to her right. It was a seat of honor, a silent message to everyone in the room that I was her chosen operative for this upcoming project. The doors clicked shut, locking us in. Sarah pressed a button on the console and the smart screen behind her hummed to life. "We have secured the capital for our next major play," she announced. "The market conditions are optimal and the target is vulnerable. We are initiating a hostile takeover." She pressed the remote again. The logo of the target company flashed onto the glowing screen. The breath caught in my throat. I stared at the name illuminated in stark white letters against the dark background. My heart pounded against my ribs. It was the exact same tech company, the premier client Preston had just secured, the company my father had staked his entire boutique advisory firm on. Sarah began outlining the initial attack strategy. She explained how we would ruthlessly devalue their stock and dismantle their corporate defense, forcing a rapid buyout. Her voice was steady and clinical, but the words faded into a low buzz in my ears. I looked at the financial data scrolling across the screen. I knew those numbers intimate and well. I had just spent a sleepless night in Brooklyn restructuring them. The reality of the situation crashed over me with staggering force. My father and my brother were acting as the advisory defense team for the very company my firm was about to annihilate. They had unknowingly stepped directly into Sarah Caldwell's crosshairs, and they were walking into battle wearing the armor I had built for them. The flawed, collapsing armor with the poison pill waiting inside. I gripped my pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. Sarah paused her presentation and looked down at me. She asked if I saw any immediate structural weaknesses we could exploit in the target's recent public filings. I looked up at the screen and then met her eyes. Yes, I replied, my voice perfectly calm. Their debt-to-equity models are a facade. One hard push and the entire foundation will shatter. Sarah smiled. It was a terrifying, calculating expression. The collision course was set, but the battlefield was about to become infinitely more complicated because destroying my family's client meant navigating a legal minefield that could send me to federal prison. The heavy glass doors of the conference room glided shut, leaving just Sarah and me alone in the quiet space. The hum of the city outside felt distant. Sarah set her digital presenter down on the marble table. Her expression shifted from the performative confidence of a vice president addressing her team to the stark calculation of a general sizing up her soldier. She walked over to the window and looked out at the skyline before turning back to face me. She told me she was already aware of the opposing counsel. She knew my father and his boutique firm had secured the defense contract for the tech client. She did not ask if I could handle the emotional strain of fighting my own blood. She only asked if I was ready to face the compliance department. We took the elevator down to the 42nd floor. The environment shifted instantly. The vibrant, high-stakes energy of the acquisitions bullpen was replaced by the sterile, windowless corridors of corporate legal. The air smelled of ozone and fresh printer paper. We entered a sparse meeting room where the chief legal officer was already waiting. He was a stern man who rarely smiled and viewed every employee as a potential liability to the firm. He slid a thick bound document across the gray table. The title page read, Conflict of Interest and Non-Disclosure Waiver. It was a draconian piece of legal architecture. The chief legal officer did not mince words. He explained the exact parameters of my involvement. Because my father and brother were the direct adversaries on this acquisition, my employment was now subject to federal oversight. If I shared a single detail of our timeline with my family, I would face immediate termination. If I offered Preston even a hint of advice on how to structure his counter-offers, I would be referred to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The penalties were not just civil. We were talking about corporate espionage and insider trading. We were talking about real prison time. I stared at the thick stack of paper. For my entire life, my father had dictated the rules of engagement. He used his wealth and his position to bend people to his will. I recalled a summer during my freshman year of college when he threatened to sue a local contractor into bankruptcy over a minor scheduling dispute. He always acted as though the law was a weapon designed exclusively for his use. He believed he was untouchable. But sitting in that freezing legal conference room, I realized the law was about to become my ultimate shield. Signing this document meant building an ironclad firewall between myself and the toxic demands of my family. It meant I could no longer operate as the disposable engine powering my brother and his unearned success. Even if I felt a sudden pang of guilt in the middle of the night, I would be legally barred from acting on it. The waiver would lock me into the role of the apex predator. The chief legal officer handed me a heavy silver pen. He told me to take my time and read every clause. I did not need time. I uncapped the pen and pressed the tip to the signature line. The ink flowed dark and smooth across the page. With a few sharp strokes, I severed the invisible tether that had bound me to my father and his expectations for 28 years. I handed the document back. The legal officer looked mildly surprised by my lack of hesitation. Sarah merely nodded her approval. The psychological shift inside me was profound. The chronic low-level anxiety that had always hummed in my chest The fear of disappointing my parents, the desperate need to prove my worth, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, structural clarity. I was no longer a daughter seeking validation. I was the lead strategist of a hostile takeover, and my target was sitting right in front of me. We rode the elevator back up to the 60th floor. Sarah instructed me to begin adapting our strike plan immediately. I sat at my desk and pulled up the raw data files on the tech client. Our firm possessed vast resources and an arsenal of financial algorithms designed to devalue and consume vulnerable companies. Usually, an acquisitions team had to probe the perimeter of a target for weeks to find a structural weakness. I did not need to probe. I had the blueprints to the fortress because I had laid the foundation myself. I opened the attack strategy and began recalibrating our financial weapons. I targeted the exact trap errors I had embedded in the defense models I ghost wrote for Preston. I aimed our initial short-selling strikes directly at the volatile market index I had disguised as a stable bond yield. When our firm applied pressure to that specific point, the tech client's debt-to-equity ratios would snap. The math was elegant. For years, I had watched my father operate on bluster and intimidation. He believed that speaking louder than everyone else in the room made him right. He taught Preston the exact same method. They treated finance like a golf course negotiation, where charm and a firm handshake could cover up a lack of fundamental knowledge. But the market did not care about charm. The market only responded to leverage and structural integrity. I mapped out the exact points where our firm would strike. The first blow would be subtle. A quiet accumulation of short positions that would gently test the tech client's liquidity. Preston would ignore it, assuming it was regular market fluctuation. The second blow would be direct. A targeted devaluation of their primary assets. That is when the trap errors in his defense would activate. The internal algorithms he presented to his board would fail to reconcile the dropping asset values against their inflated debt. The model would fracture. I knew exactly how the scenario would unfold on the other side of the city. Preston would see the incoming financial strikes and stare at his monitors in total confusion. He would not understand why his pristine charts were turning red. He would look for a solution in the models and find nothing but complex math that he could not read. He would panic. And my father would realize too late that his golden son was standing on quicksand. I worked through the afternoon fueled by a quiet, relentless focus. The numbers bent to my will. I mapped out a sequence of fiscal maneuvers that would dismantle the tech client's public valuation over a span of 5 days. Each strike was designed to trigger the next flaw in my brother and his ghost-written defense. It was a beautiful, cascading sequence of destruction. As the sun dipped below the Manhattan skyline, casting long shadows across my desk, my personal cell phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from my mother. She was writing in the family group chat again. "We are so incredibly proud of Preston today," she wrote. "We are hosting a celebration dinner for him this Friday at the Prime Steakhouse downtown. The chief executive officer of his new tech client is going to join us. Victoria, you should come too. It will be nice for you to see what real corporate success looks like." I read the message twice. The condescension was woven so naturally into her invitation she likely did not even register it. She wanted me there to serve as the baseline for Preston and his triumph. She wanted the invisible daughter sitting at the edge of the table, applauding the golden son, while he entertained his wealthy new client. The old Victoria would have declined the invitation, citing work exhaustion, to avoid the humiliation. But the lead strategist sitting at the desk knew better. If I suddenly withdrew from family events, my father might grow suspicious. He might start looking too closely at my firm and uncover the impending attack before the trap could fully close. I needed to maintain my cover. I needed to sit across from them and smile while holding the knife in the dark. I picked up my phone and typed a response. I told her I would not miss it for the world. I hit send and watched the message bubble appear on the screen. The hostile takeover was officially in motion. But before the market opened and the real financial bloodletting began, I had to survive a 3-course dinner with the men I was about to destroy. Friday evening arrived with a biting chill sweeping off the Hudson River, but the atmosphere inside the prime Manhattan steakhouse was sweltering. The restaurant was a fortress of dark mahogany, deep crimson leather booths, and the low hum of million-dollar deals being negotiated over dry-aged ribeyes. It was the exact kind of establishment my father preferred. He loved places where the waiters memorized your surname and the lighting was dim enough to hide the desperation in the eyes of a client. I arrived 10 minutes early and gave the hostess my name. She guided me through the maze of tables to a private alcove near the back. My family was already seated. My father occupied the center chair facing the dining room so he could survey the floor like a monarch. Preston sat to his right wearing a tailored navy suit that looked fresh off the rack but fit too tightly across his shoulders. My mother was positioned next to my father wearing her pearls and a practiced smile. Sitting across from Preston was the guest of honor. The chief executive officer of the tech firm was an older man with sharp gray eyes and the weathered posture of someone who had survived multiple economic bursts. He did not wear a tie. He projected the quiet certainty of a man who built things from the ground up, rather than inheriting them. I approached the table and slipped into the empty chair next to the executive. My father offered a brief, tight smile of acknowledgement. He did not stand to greet me. "Victoria, you made it?" my father said. His tone was light, but carried the unmistakable edge of a host checking off a minor chore. "I am glad you could join us to celebrate the triumph of your brother." I smiled and placed my purse on the floor. "It is wonderful to be here," I replied. My father signaled the waiter with a flick of his wrist. He ordered a bottle of scotch that cost more than my first car. The conversation flowed easily around the table, driven entirely by the booming voice of my father. He recounted the highlights of the pitch meeting, painting Preston as a visionary strategist who had single-handedly outmaneuvered every other advisory firm in the city. Preston nodded along, offering modest chuckles, while his eyes darted around the restaurant, soaking in the ambient status. The tech executive listened politely. He took measured sips of his water and offered the appropriate nods, but his sharp gray eyes absorbed everything. I watched him study Preston. He was looking for the intellect that supposedly built the flawless defense models sitting in his briefcase. When the waiter returned with the scotch and poured the drinks, my father raised his glass. "To the future of the Watson legacy," he proclaimed. We all clapped our glasses together. The crystal chimed. As the glasses were lowered, my father turned his attention to me. The spotlight shifted and I knew exactly what role I was expected to play. "So, Victoria," my father started. His voice dripped with loud, patronizing concern. "Are you managing to keep up with the filing at your new job? It must be quite a chaotic environment for you. Just remember not to let the partners intimidate you. Everyone starts at the bottom." My mother let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. "We are just so proud of you for trying something new, sweetheart." The tech executive glanced at me, his expression neutral. To him, I was exactly what my father presented. The slow, invisible daughter relegated to administrative duties, while the brilliant son conquered the financial world. I lowered my eyes and offered a sheepish grin. I traced the edge of my water glass with my index finger. "It is definitely a fast-paced office, Dad," I said, keeping my voice soft and deferential. "There is a lot of paperwork to process. I am just trying to stay organized and learn the ropes." My father chuckled and took a long swallow of his scotch. "That is the spirit. Know your limits and play your part." The waiter arrived with our entrees, interrupting the lesson in mediocrity. Thick cuts of seared beef, fresh oysters, and roasted asparagus covered the table. The conversation shifted back to the tech sector. The executive began discussing his company and the upcoming quarter. He talked about market volatility and the challenge of scaling operations during uncertain economic periods. He was a man who understood risk. I sliced my steak and ate in silence, listening to the rhythm of the discussion. I was waiting for the perfect opening. I knew the exact mathematical flaw buried deep inside the models Preston had presented to this man. I knew the exact stress point our firm was going to strike on Monday morning. I just needed to introduce the concept to the room without leaving a single fingerprint. The opportunity presented itself during a natural lull in the conversation. The waiter had just cleared the plates and poured the last of the scotch. The table was relaxed. Preston was leaning back in his chair, looking thoroughly satisfied with his own existence. I dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin and turned slightly toward the executive. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression entirely innocent. "Mr. Sterling," I said softly, breaking the quiet. "I was reading a fascinating article about your sector the other day. It was talking about the new challenges in supply chain financing. Out of curiosity, how does a company like yours handle the sudden compression of Tier 2 liquidity reserves if the bond yields invert? It seems like such a terrifying scenario." The question hung in the air above the empty plates. It was a highly complex targeted inquiry. It was the exact scenario our hostile takeover strategy was designed to trigger. If bond yields inverted, the hidden trap errors in the defense models of my brother would force a liquidity compression, tearing the tech client valuation to shreds. Sterling stopped swirling his scotch. He placed the glass down on the white tablecloth. His gray eyes sharpened, focusing on me with sudden, genuine interest. The patronizing assumption that I was just a filing clerk vanished from his expression. "That is an incredibly astute observation," Victoria Sterling said. His voice was slow and measuring. "Most seasoned analysts do not even factor Tier 2 compression into their quarterly risk assessments. It is a terrifying scenario." He turned his gaze away from me and looked directly across the table. He looked at the golden boy. He looked at the supposed architect of his financial defense. Preston Sterling continued, "I know we glossed over the macro variables during the pitch, but since your sister brought it up, I am curious. How exactly did you structure the fail-safe for a yield inversion within our new debt-to-equity ratio?" The silence that followed was suffocating. I watched the face of my brother lose its color. His tan skin turned a sickly pale shade in the dim restaurant lighting. He blinked rapidly. He looked at Sterling and then glanced at my father. Preston opened his mouth, but no words came out. The brilliant strategist was staring at a question he could not comprehend. He did not know what Tier 2 liquidity meant. He did not know how a bond yield inverted. He only knew how to read the glossy summary pages I had typed for him. "Well," Preston stammered. His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie, pulling it away from his neck. "The fail-safe is inherent in the holistic approach we took. We are looking at a paradigm shift in the bandwidth of the assets. The synergy of the reserves will naturally hedge against any compression." It was an empty salad of corporate buzzwords. It meant nothing. Sterling did not nod. He did not smile. He just stared at Preston. The silence of the executive was a heavy, crushing weight pressing down on the table. He was a man who built software algorithms and hardware supply chains. He knew the difference between a mathematical fail-safe and panicked jargon. My father realized the danger instantly. A bead of sweat formed near his hairline. He let out a loud, forced laugh and clapped his hands together, shattering the awkward tension. "David, please," my father said, leaning across the table with a wide, desperate grin. "Let us not drag the boy back into the trenches over dessert. Preston spent 72 hours staring at spreadsheets to perfect your models. His brain is officially off the clock for the weekend. Let us talk about your golf swing. I hear you are heading to Pebble Beach next month." My father waved the waiter over and loudly ordered a round of espresso, demanding the dessert menus. He threw his entire personality over the gaping hole in the intellect of his son, attempting to smother the interaction with sheer volume and charm. Sterling accepted the change of subject. He offered a polite smile and discussed his upcoming golf trip. He drank his espresso and thanked my parents for the lavish dinner. On the surface, the evening concluded smoothly. Handshakes were exchanged and the valet brought the cars around, but the damage was done. Before leaving the table, Sterling looked at Preston one last time. It was a fleeting glance, but I saw the calculation behind his gray eyes. The blind trust he had placed in the boutique firm of my father was fractured. The seed of doubt had been planted deep in the fertile soil of his corporate paranoia. When Monday morning arrived and the market began to test his company foundation, Sterling would not look at his sinking stock with confusion. He would remember the stammering, panicked face of the boy who built his armor. I stood on the sidewalk and hugged my mother goodbye. I shook the hand of my father and told Preston how proud I was of his big win. I hailed a cab and slid into the back seat alone. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, merging into the relentless traffic of the city, I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window. My cover was flawless. My fingerprints were entirely invisible. The target was primed and the trap was ready to snap shut. But I still needed to uncover the true depths of the rot hiding inside the ledgers of my father. Monday morning arrived with the sterile hum of the air conditioning inside the glass-walled war room on the 60th floor. The weekend was over and the polite facade of the steakhouse dinner had been locked away. I swiped my keycard against the secure reader and pushed open the heavy door. Sarah was already sitting at the far end of the long conference table, bathed in the glow of 3 separate monitors. She did not look up when I entered. She just slid a silver encrypted flash drive across the polished surface toward an empty workstation. The drive contained the preliminary due diligence data for our hostile takeover target. When a firm like ours initiates a strike, we utilize legal channels to access a staggering amount of confidential information regarding the structural integrity of the opposing company and their advisory representatives. It was top-tier corporate clearance. We had the blueprints to the tech client, and by extension, the financial architecture my father had built for them. I plugged the drive into my terminal and began the vetting process. For the first few hours, the work was tedious and routine. I sifted through quarterly earnings reports, tax filings, and standard compliance disclosures. I was looking for the exact coordinates of the trap errors I had embedded in the defense models of my brother. I needed to verify their placement before our firm executed the initial short-selling maneuvers. By noon, the skyline outside the window was hidden behind a thick blanket of gray rain. I opened the folder containing the escrow ledgers. In high-level corporate acquisitions, escrow acts as a neutral locked box. Client funds are held in these secure accounts pending the resolution of various deals and market shifts. The golden rule of advisory finance is that you never touch the contents of the locked box. It is a sacred trust. I scrolled through the routing numbers, scanning the columns of incoming and outgoing digital transfers. My eyes caught a rhythmic anomaly. At first, it looked like a standard administrative rounding function. Small fractional percentages of the tech client cash were moving out of the primary escrow account at regular intervals. I leaned closer to the screen. My training kicked in. A healthy advisory firm does not bleed fractional percentages of client money into undocumented holding accounts. I highlighted the routing sequence and ran a reverse trace through our proprietary forensic software. The progress bar on my screen ticked forward slowly. The room was dead silent except for the clicking of my keyboard. The software bypassed the first layer of digital shell entities and hit the terminal destination. The screen flashed green, displaying the ownership registry of the receiving accounts. I stopped breathing. The accounts belonged to the boutique firm of my father. He was not just moving administrative fees, he was siphoning millions of dollars from the secure escrow of his premier tech client. I opened a secondary window and pulled the public credit filings for the Watson boutique firm. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The firm was drowning. They had suffered catastrophic leverage failures in the previous fiscal year, likely due to the gross incompetence of my brother and the blind arrogance of my father. They were insolvent. The custom-tailored suits, the vintage scotch, the country club memberships, and the luxury cars were all a mirage. My father was maintaining his elite Manhattan lifestyle by stealing from the very people who hired him for protection. He was commingling stolen client capital to illegally mask his own sinking ship and float his margin calls. He was using the tech executive I had dined with on Friday night as an illegal life raft to avoid federal bankruptcy. I pushed my chair back from the desk. the cold reality of the data washed over me. I had spent my entire life believing my father was a titan of industry. I thought his cruelty stemmed from a place of genuine superiority. I thought he overlooked me because I did not measure up to his towering intellect. But sitting in the quiet war room, staring at the undeniable proof of his fraud, every single interaction we ever had was instantly recontextualized. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the folded printed email he had sent to Sarah 3 months ago. I traced the black ink where he had called me easily overwhelmed. He did not write those words because he was a spiteful patriarch. He wrote them because he was a cornered criminal acting out of pure primal self-preservation. He knew I was applying for a strategy role at one of the most ruthless forensic firms in the country. He knew the rigorous training I would undergo. He was terrified. He realized that if I gained real power and actual analytical skills in the financial sector, I would eventually possess the exact tools required to recognize the paper trail of his collapsing, fraudulent empire. He needed me fetching coffee and filing paperwork. He needed me blind because an educated daughter was the greatest threat to his survival. The profound irony was that his attempt to blind me was the exact catalyst that handed me the magnifying glass. I turned my attention back to the monitor. The initial shock gave way to a surgical clinical focus. If I was going to use this information to secure the buyout and annihilate his firm, I needed the specific authorization logs. I needed to see whose digital fingerprints were on the wire transfers. I accessed the encrypted signature registry. I pulled up the PDF scans of the fraudulent escrow withdrawals. The documents loaded one by one, filling my screen with undeniable proof of federal crimes. I zoomed in on the bottom right corner of the first transfer, expecting to see the familiar looping scrawl of my father. My blood ran cold. It was not his signature. The ink belonged to Preston. I opened the next document. Preston. I opened 10 more. Every single illegal transfer, every stolen dollar, every fabricated ledger was authorized, signed, and dated by the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions. The memory of the graduation party flashed in my mind. The rooftop venue, the new Porsche, and my father proudly handing Preston the keys to his new executive title. It had never been a reward. It was a trap. My father knew his firm was rotting from the inside. He promoted his golden boy to the highest position of fiduciary duty so he could legally pin the impending disaster on the idiot son who signed whatever paperwork was put in front of him. My father was grooming Preston to be the legal fall guy. He was willing to send his own son to a federal penitentiary just to shield himself from the consequences of his own greed. The sheer depth of the betrayal transcended anything I had imagined. My father did not love Preston any more than he loved me. We were both just tools. I was the disposable engine meant to build the facade, and Preston was the sacrificial lamb meant to take the slaughter when the facade collapsed. I saved the authorization logs to an encrypted folder on the secure drive. I had the weapon. I possessed the exact leverage required to force the tech client to drop my father and surrender to the hostile takeover. But a new dangerous variable entered the equation. The corporate world is a small, interconnected ecosystem. Gossip travels faster than light across the trading floors. If my father caught even a whisper from his industry contacts that I was the lead analyst assigned to vet this specific acquisition, he would realize the danger instantly. He would know I had the clearance to see the escrow accounts. He would know his secret was exposed to the one person he tried to keep in the dark. I glanced at the digital clock on the corner of my screen. It was late afternoon. I needed to solidify the evidence before he realized I was looking. But as I reached for my coffee, my desk phone began to ring with a harsh, urgent tone. I looked at the caller ID. It was the internal line for the chief compliance officer of our firm. The battle was no longer hiding in the shadows. The predator had realized he was being hunted. The shrill ring of my desk phone shattered the quiet focus of the war room. I pulled my eyes away from the encrypted escrow ledgers and stared at the blinking red light on the console. It was the internal extension for the chief compliance officer. In the high-stakes ecosystem of corporate acquisitions, a call from compliance was never a friendly check-in. It was the grim reaper of Wall Street careers. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. The voice on the other end was flat and mechanical, instructing me to report to Conference Room 4 on the executive level immediately. I hung up the phone and locked my terminal, securing the evidence of the stolen funds. The walk from the bullpen to the executive suites felt like a march to the gallows. The atmosphere in the office seemed to drop 10 degrees. Colleagues who normally offered a quick nod or a tight smile kept their eyes glued to their monitors as I passed. Word traveled fast in this firm. They smelled blood in the water. I pushed open the heavy oak door of Conference Room 4. The space was sparse, featuring a single round table under a harsh fluorescent light. Sarah Caldwell sat near the window, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Across from her sat Thomas, the director of compliance. He was a man built like a vault with a pristine suit and an unsettling, unblinking stare. He motioned for me to take the empty seat across from him. I sat down and folded my hands on the table, keeping my breathing steady. "Victoria, we have a serious situation," Thomas began, his voice echoing slightly in the bare room. "Less than an hour ago, our legal department received an urgent external grievance. It is a formal complaint of unethical conduct, corporate extortion, and breach of confidentiality." He slid a printed document across the table. I did not need to read the signature at the bottom to know who sent it, but my eyes drifted down the page anyway. The complainant was Richard Watson. My father had struck first. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "The managing partner of the opposing advisory firm claims that you used a private family dinner this past Friday to ambush his executive team. He states that you threatened to leverage your position on our acquisitions roster to inflict undue market harm unless he provided you with confidential defense strategies. He is demanding your immediate removal from the deal and threatening to refer the matter to the Securities and Exchange Commission if we do not terminate your employment by the end of the business day." The silence in the room was heavy. Sarah watched me closely, waiting to see if the pressure would crack my composure. I looked down at the fabricated report. The narrative was a masterclass in manipulation. My father had taken the subtle, targeted question I asked the tech executive about Tier 2 liquidity and twisted it into a malicious extortion attempt. The industry chatter must have reached him over the weekend. Someone at his country club or a loose-lipped junior analyst at a networking event must have mentioned the roster for Sarah Caldwell's new strike team. When my father heard my name attached to the hostile takeover targeting his premier client, the arrogance evaporated and the terror set in. He realized the daughter he had dismissed as a clerical worker was holding a magnifying glass over his insolvent, rotting firm. He knew that if I looked closely at the ledgers, I would find the millions of dollars he had stolen from the escrow accounts. Instead of calling me or appealing to our bloodline, he did what a cornered predator always does. He went for the throat. A memory from my early teenage years surfaced in my mind. We were spending the summer at a rented lake house. My father had borrowed a pristine sailboat from a wealthy neighbor. While trying to dock the boat after a few too many drinks, he misjudged the wind and scraped the hull deeply against the wooden pier, causing thousands of dollars in damage. Instead of owning his mistake, he walked straight to the house of the neighbor and loudly complained that their teenage son had untied the mooring lines as a prank, causing the boat to drift and crash. He ruined the summer of that kid just to shield his own ego. It was his signature move: strike preemptively, accuse loudly, and force the other party onto the defensive. He was running the exact same playbook right now. He wanted me panicked and fired before I could unearth his federal crimes. Thomas cleared his throat. "Victoria, this firm operates on a zero-tolerance policy for ethical breaches. If there is even a shadow of truth to these allegations, your career in finance is over. We need your response for the official record." I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice or scramble to defend my character. The panic my father was counting on did not exist. The waiver I had signed in the legal department days ago had stripped away my emotional vulnerability and replaced it with cold structural armor. I reached into the leather portfolio I had carried into the room and withdrew a single sheet of paper. I slid it across the table, stopping it right next to the fabricated grievance. That is the carbon copy of the conflict of interest and non-disclosure waiver I signed last week, I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying a sharp edge. Thomas glanced at the document. I am aware of the waiver, Victoria. Signing it does not prove you adhered to it. I looked him directly in the eye. Please check the timestamp of my signature and then check the internal human resources log. You will find that I officially registered my attendance at that family dinner 48 hours before the reservation. I documented the location, the attendees, and my relation to opposing counsel. I followed protocol to the letter. I paused, letting the weight of my meticulous preparations settle over the room. Furthermore, I continued, leaning in slightly. The timeline of this grievance is illogical. My father claims I attempted to extort confidential defense strategies from him. But as the lead strategist of this hostile takeover, I already possess top-tier corporate clearance. I have legal authorized access to their public filings, their quarterly projections, and their structural architecture. Why would I risk federal prison to extort information I already hold in my hand? Thomas studied the waiver and then looked at the fabricated complaint. The rigid lines of his face softened just a fraction. He was a man who traded in facts, and the facts I presented were bulletproof. He is terrified, I said, shifting my gaze to Sarah. Her eyes were bright with predatory interest. Opposing counsel just realized we have their client locked in our sights. This complaint is not a genuine ethical grievance. It is a desperate intimidation tactic designed to derail our momentum and remove the lead analyst who knows their structural weaknesses better than anyone else. He is trying to blind us. Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was smooth and laced with dangerous satisfaction. Victoria is right. Richard Watson is throwing up a smokescreen because he knows his defense models are fundamentally flawed. If he is willing to file a fraudulent compliance report against his own daughter, it means we have pushed him to the edge of the cliff. Thomas gathered the papers and placed them into his folder. He nodded slowly. The timeline supports your account, Victoria. The proactive disclosure of the dinner shields you from the extortion claim. I am dismissing the grievance as frivolous. We will not be bullied by the desperate flailing of a boutique firm. You are cleared to return to your desk. The director of compliance stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Sarah and me alone. The dynamic in the conference room shifted the moment the door clicked shut. The formal tension evaporated, replaced by the electric hum of impending victory. I had survived the attempt on my career. My father had fired his best shot and missed. Sarah poured 2 glasses of water from the crystal pitcher on the table and pushed one toward me. You handled that perfectly, she said, taking a sip. You kept your emotions out of the room and let the protocol do the heavy lifting. But this changes our timeline. Richard Watson is no longer an arrogant man coasting on his reputation. He is a cornered animal, and cornered animals make unpredictable moves. I stared at the condensation forming on the outside of my glass. He is not just trying to protect his pride, Sarah. I spent the morning running forensic traces on their escrow ledgers. I found millions of dollars in unauthorized withdrawals, transferred directly into the operating accounts of his firm. He is insolvent. He is using this tech client as a shield to hide staggering corporate fraud. Sarah lowered her glass. Her expression hardened, transforming from a competitive strategist into a ruthless executioner. The stakes had just leaped from a standard market acquisition to the dismantling of a criminal enterprise. If he knows you are on the team, he will expect us to strike at his weakest point, Sarah murmured, tracing the rim of her glass. He will try to reinforce his defenses and hide the paper trail. We cannot just hit him with a standard short sell anymore. We need to lure him out of his bunker. I looked up, meeting her sharp gaze. Then we give him exactly what he wants. We make him think his intimidation tactic worked. We make him think I slipped up and left the door open. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that made rival executives lose sleep. When prey panics, you do not chase them into the woods. You lay a trap in the clearing and let them walk right into the teeth. The counterstrike was already forming in our minds. It was time to orchestrate a double cross that would tear the Watson legacy down to the studs. Sarah and I did not leave the building that night. We ordered black coffee and spread our laptops across the marble table in the war room. The failed compliance attack proved my father was operating on pure adrenaline and fear. We needed to harness that momentum. Sarah explained the mechanics of a honeypot operation. In the corporate espionage ecosystem, information was currency, but fake information wrapped in authentic encryption was a weapon. We needed to draft a shadow playbook. I opened a secure sandbox environment on my terminal. My task was to design a set of financial projections that looked identical to our actual hostile takeover strategy, but fundamentally altered the coordinates of our strike. I painted a picture of hesitation. I manipulated the internal memos to suggest our firm was losing faith in the acquisition. I drafted fake risk assessment reports claiming the tech client held too much hidden debt, making a direct buyout unfeasible. The narrative I constructed pointed toward a slow, conservative retreat rather than an imminent blitz. For the trap to work, the bait had to taste real. I remembered sitting across the chessboard from my father when I was 12 years old. He never played defensively. He always pushed his knights forward early, seeking a quick, humiliating victory. If I ever left a bishop unprotected, he would snatch it without scanning the rest of the board. He was addicted to the dopamine rush of capitalizing on the mistakes of other people. His arrogance was a permanent blind spot. He believed that if he found an opening, it was because he was brilliant, not because it was a snare. I applied that same psychology to the digital dead drop. I did not just leave the files sitting on an unsecured server. That would raise suspicion. Instead, I buried the dummy intelligence beneath 3 layers of archaic corporate encryption. I used security protocols that were standard 5 years ago. They were tough enough to look authentic, but brittle enough for the boutique firm hackers to crack within a few hours. I placed the encrypted folder on a secondary server normally used for low-priority vendor contracts and intentionally left a digital footprint pointing toward it in the public metadata of an innocuous press release. The sun crept over the East River, casting pale morning light across the bullpen. We had laid the snare. Now we had to wait. Sarah stood by the window drinking her 4th cup of coffee, watching the city wake up. I sat at my terminal monitoring the external ping requests on the vendor server. The financial district is full of shadows and back channels. Boutique advisory firms like the one my father ran did not employ physical spies. They hired freelance data brokers, phantoms who scraped metadata and looked for unsecured backdoors in corporate networks. At 9 in the morning, the server log registered a ping, a tiny silent knock on the digital door. I held my breath, watching the code scroll across my monitor. The intruder probed the first layer of encryption. They found the archaic security protocol exactly as I had designed it. They retreated, then returned 10 minutes later with the correct decryption key. I narrated the breach aloud to Sarah. "They are through the firewall," I said, my voice steady. "They have located the dummy folder. Let them download it," Sarah replied. Her eyes locked on the screen. "Do not trace the IP address yet. Let them think they pulled off the heist of the century." I watched the data transfer metric tick upward. The intruder was pulling the fake memos, the altered risk assessments, and the doctored strategy playbook. They were stealing a map to a minefield, believing it was the key to the kingdom. Once the download completed, the intruder vanished, wiping their digital footprint from the access log. To an untrained eye, the server looked untouched, but I had written a silent tracker into the dummy files, a microscopic line of code that would ping my terminal the moment the documents were opened on a new machine. 20 minutes later, the tracker lit up. The IP address originated from the executive suite of my father's boutique firm. He was reading my ghost-written lies. We spent the next 48 hours watching the market pulse. If my father believed the dummy intelligence, he would alter the defense posture of his tech client. The fake memos suggested our firm was backing off due to fears of hidden debt. Therefore, a man operating on supreme arrogance would attempt to project overwhelming financial strength to scare us away permanently. By Wednesday afternoon, the public filings began to shift. The tech client announced a sudden sweeping restructuring of their short-term liabilities. I pulled the fresh data into my terminal and ran the numbers. A cold, triumphant chill spread down my spine. My father had taken the bait whole. He had instructed Preston to liquidate their secure long-term bonds and convert them into volatile high-yield assets. He was over-leveraging their remaining capital to paint a picture of untouchable liquidity. He thought he was building an imposing fortress wall to deter our retreat. He did not realize he was stripping the armor off the exact vulnerability I had targeted from the very beginning. By restructuring the debt, he had manually removed the fail-safes that were keeping the tech client afloat. Sarah reviewed the shifted assets. Her lips curled into a sharp, predatory smile. "He just dug his own grave," she murmured. He locked his client in the bear trap and threw away the key. The hostile takeover was no longer a battle of attrition. It was going to be an execution. We had the exact coordinates to shatter their valuation and the financial leverage to expose the stolen escrow funds. The trap was spring-loaded. All I had to do was push the button and watch the algorithms tear his empire to shreds. I prepared to initiate the real strike sequence. I opened the execution portal and authorized the initial wave of short sells targeting the vulnerable yields Preston had just exposed. I felt a fleeting sense of finality. The invisible daughter was about to become the architect of their ruin. But as my fingers hovered over the keyboard, my screen flashed with an incoming priority email. It was not from my father. It was not a frantic message from my brother begging for help. It was a direct encrypted message sent to my private corporate address. I checked the sender verification and my pulse spiked. The email came from David Sterling, the chief executive officer of the tech firm, the man I had spoken to at the steakhouse dinner. I opened the message. The body of the text was brief, devoid of any pleasantries or corporate formalities. "Victoria," he wrote. "Your brother cannot explain the yield inversion on our updated ledgers. His models are falling apart, and your father is refusing to let my internal auditors see the escrow accounts. I remember the question you asked me at dinner. I know you understand the math they are hiding. We need to talk before the market opens tomorrow." The battlefield had just expanded. The board of directors at the tech firm was starting to ask questions, and the golden boy was running out of answers. Sterling was bypassing his own defense team and reaching out directly to the enemy because he smelled the rot in the foundation. I stared at the screen, realizing that the client my father was trying to use as a shield was about to hand me the sword. Thursday morning broke with a pale gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 60th floor war room. I sat at my workstation, staring at the encrypted email from David Sterling. The chief executive officer of the tech firm was demanding an explanation for the collapsing numbers his board of directors was seeing. My father was refusing to let the internal auditors near the escrow accounts. The rot was starting to show through the floorboards. I did not write a long, intricate response to Sterling. I typed a single sentence confirming that the math was indeed failing and instructing him to convene an emergency meeting of his board at his corporate headquarters for tomorrow morning. I hit send and deleted the trace of the message from my outbox. The client was primed. Now it was time to execute the market strike. At 9:25, the trading floor outside the war room grew quiet. The usual chaotic hum of analysts shouting over phones and keyboards clicking faded into a tense, expectant silence. Sarah Caldwell stood at the head of the conference table, her eyes locked on the digital clock mounted on the wall. The red numbers ticked closer to the opening bell. She held a sleek black tablet in her hands, her thumb hovering over the execution authorization. We had spent the last 3 days feeding my father dummy intelligence, leading him to manually dismantle the defensive armor of his own client. The tech firm was standing on the trading floor without a shield. The clock struck 9:30. The market opened. Sarah pressed her thumb against the glass screen of the tablet. "Initiate the sequence," she ordered, her voice cutting through the quiet room. I executed the command on my terminal. Our firm launched the first wave of targeted short sells aiming directly at the high-yield volatile assets my father had just purchased for the tech client. The market reaction was instantaneous. Financial algorithms are predatory by nature. They are designed to scan the market for weakness and exploit it without hesitation. When our initial strike hit the vulnerable yields, the automated trading bots utilized by other hedge funds noticed the sudden drop. They smelled the blood in the water and joined the feeding frenzy. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the primary monitor. The stock ticker for the tech client flashed on the screen. The numbers turned red. It started as a subtle dip, a fraction of a point here and there, but within 15 minutes the dip became a steady downward slope. That was the exact moment the trap errors inside the defense models of my brother activated. When the stock price dropped below a specific threshold, the defensive algorithms Preston had presented to the tech board were supposed to kick in and stabilize the valuation. They were supposed to trigger a failsafe to protect the core assets. But there was no failsafe. I had designed the math to look like a safety net while functioning as an anchor. The internal algorithms failed to reconcile the dropping asset values against the inflated debt my father had created. The debt-to-equity ratio fractured. The numbers began to cascade, feeding incorrect data back into the market and accelerating the panic. The tech client was bleeding value in real time. Millions of dollars were evaporating from their market capitalization every passing minute. I picked up my ceramic coffee mug and took a slow sip of the dark roast. The liquid was warm and bitter. My heart rate did not elevate, my hands did not tremble. I felt an eerie, profound stillness wash over me. I was watching the destruction of a corporate empire, and I was the architect who drafted the blueprints. In my peripheral vision, my personal cell phone lit up on the desk. The screen glowed with a new text message notification. I set my mug down and glanced at the device. The sender was Preston. The first message was brief. "Hey, are you at your desk? I need you to look at a spreadsheet for me." It was his standard opening line. The casual, entitled tone of a boy who believed the world existed to solve his problems. I remembered a rainy Tuesday night during his sophomore year of college. He had failed his midterm exams and called me in a panic, demanding I rewrite his term papers before dawn. When he wrecked his first car, driving recklessly through a suburban intersection, my father had simply paid the other driver a quiet settlement and bought Preston a newer model the very next day. Preston had navigated his entire 26 years on Earth, enclosed in a protective bubble woven by the wealth and arrogance of our father. He had never faced a consequence he could not charm or purchase his way out of. But you cannot charm an algorithmic trading bot. You cannot buy off a collapsing debt-to-equity ratio. The market is a cold, unfeeling mirror, and it was finally reflecting the profound incompetence of the golden boy. I did not reply to the first text. I just watched the screen. 2 minutes later, a second message appeared. The tone shifted. "Victoria, pick up your phone. The yields are inverting. I am looking at the dashboard and the numbers are turning red. What does a Tier 2 liquidity compression mean?" 30 seconds passed. A third message arrived, then a fourth. The notifications began to stack up rapidly, filling the locked screen with desperate pleas. "The board is calling my office," he typed. "Sterling is screaming at Dad in the hallway. The models are breaking apart and I do not know how to stop it. You built the math. You have to tell me how to fix the math. Please call me right now." I reached out and picked up the phone, unlocking the screen to read the full thread. The frantic energy radiating from his words was palpable. The golden boy was unraveling. He was sitting in his corner office, watching the unearned foundation of his career crumble into dust. He was staring at a financial fire he did not understand and begging the sister he had always treated as invisible to bring him a bucket of water. I read every single word he wrote. The old version of me, the dutiful daughter who craved a seat at their table, would have felt a surge of adrenaline and guilt. I would have felt the overwhelming urge to log into the secure server, find the flaw, and orchestrate a miracle to save him. I would have sacrificed my own career to preserve his illusion of brilliance. But that version of me died in the legal conference room the day I signed the conflict waiver. Sitting at my desk watching the red numbers plummet on the global market index, I searched myself for a trace of empathy. I searched for a shred of familial duty or pity for the brother who was currently suffocating under the weight of his own lies. I found nothing. The well was dry. I felt only a pure crystalline clarity. They had told me my entire life that I was a background character. They told me I was not bright enough to handle the complexities of their world. My father had put those exact words in writing and sent them to my boss. They had built their towering egos by standing on my shoulders. Now I was simply stepping out of the way and letting gravity do the work. My phone buzzed in my hand with an incoming voice call. The caller ID flashed with the name of my brother. I stared at the glowing letters. I did not press the green button to accept the call. I did not press the red button to send him to voicemail. I tapped the small icon in the top right corner of the contact profile. A menu dropped down offering a list of options. I scrolled to the very bottom. I pressed the option labeled Block Contact. The screen confirmed the action and went entirely dark. The phone stopped vibrating in my hand. The frantic demands, the desperate pleas, the decades of unearned entitlement were severed in a single silent keystroke. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a heavy chain finally snapping. It was my first true assertion of absolute power. I placed the dark phone face down on the desk and returned my attention to the monitor. The tech client stock had just dropped another 3 points. The financial bloodletting was terminal. The boutique firm of my father was now officially trapped in a burning building with no exits. Sarah walked over to my workstation. She looked at the red numbers cascading across my screen and then looked down at me. Her expression was a mask of cold satisfaction. She reached into her blazer pocket and checked her own phone. David Sterling just sent a confirmation to the executive team, she said, her voice low and steady. He has called an emergency session of his board of directors for tomorrow morning at 9. He has ordered Richard and Preston to be there in person to explain the collapse of the defense models. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the screen. The snare had tightened perfectly. The panic of today was just the prelude. The real execution would happen tomorrow in a glass room overlooking the city. Gather the escrow ledgers and the authorization signatures, Sarah instructed, turning toward the door. Print hard copies. We are going to attend that meeting. It is time to show the board exactly who is managing their money. The morning of the execution brought a cold, driving rain that washed the streets of Manhattan clean. I stood in the lobby of the tech client headquarters wearing a tailored charcoal suit and holding a secure silver briefcase. Sarah Caldwell stood beside me, checking the messages on her phone with a calm, steady rhythm. The building was a towering monument to modern wealth constructed entirely of glass and steel. The security guards at the front desk cleared our credentials without a single question. We stepped into the private executive elevator, and the doors slid shut, sealing out the noise of the city. As the car ascended toward the penthouse level, I watched the floor indicator tick upward. For 28 years, my stomach would tie itself into knots whenever I knew I was about to be in the same room as my father. I had spent a lifetime anticipating his criticism, trying to shrink my presence to avoid setting off his unpredictable temper. I used to rehearse conversations in my head, hoping to say the right thing so he would look at me with the same pride he reserved for my brother. Standing in the silent ascending elevator, I searched my body for that familiar anxiety. I looked for the terrified daughter who just wanted a seat at the family table. She was gone. The space she used to occupy was filled with cold structural certainty. I was not going upstairs to seek approval. I was going upstairs to finalize a demolition. The elevator chimed and the doors opened. We stepped into a sprawling reception area paved in pristine white marble. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the main conference room, I could clearly see the battlefield. David Sterling sat at the far end of a long, polished oak table. Around him sat 7 members of his board of directors. They wore the grim, exhausted expressions of people who had spent the entire night watching their net worth evaporate. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Opposite them sat the defense team, my father and my brother. Richard was leaning forward, resting his forearms on the heavy wooden table. He was in the middle of performing his signature routine. His hands moved in wide, sweeping gestures, trying to paint a picture of temporary market volatility. He offered a tight, forced smile designed to project unshakable confidence. He was likely telling the board that the current financial bloodletting was just a minor correction, and that the brilliant strategy they had developed would stabilize the assets before the closing bell. But the physical tells betrayed his profound panic. A fine layer of perspiration shined on his forehead, catching the bright fluorescent light. He kept checking the heavy gold watch on his left wrist, a nervous tick he only displayed when he realized he was losing control of a narrative. His bespoke suit looked suddenly too large for his frame. Preston sat rigid beside him. The golden boy looked as though he had aged 5 years overnight. His posture was stiff, and his eyes darted around the room, avoiding the direct, piercing gaze of Sterling. The knot of his silk tie was pulled loose and his collar was unbuttoned. He clutched a leather portfolio to his chest like a life preserver on a sinking ship. He was terrified. He was staring at a fire he did not know how to extinguish. Sarah paused outside the heavy glass doors. She looked at me and gave a single sharp nod of confirmation. The waiting was over. We walked into the room. The double doors clicked shut behind us, sealing the chamber. The conversation at the table halted instantly. Sterling looked up, his gray eyes registering our arrival with a grim understanding. He knew exactly why we were there. He had summoned the architects of his ruin to face the firm that was currently tearing his company apart. My father turned his head, expecting to see a junior legal associate delivering coffee or fresh paperwork. When his eyes landed on Sarah, his forced smile faltered. He recognized her instantly from industry profiles. She was the vice president of the predatory firm orchestrating the financial siege against his client. Then his gaze shifted. He looked past Sarah and saw me. The transformation on his face was a profound study in psychological shock. For a fraction of a second, his brain simply rejected the visual information. The architecture of his reality did not allow for this specific scenario. In his mind, I was the invisible daughter. I was the clerical worker easily overwhelmed by complex tasks. I belonged in a basement filing cabinet, not standing at the vanguard of a high-stakes corporate execution. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ash tone. His jaw slackened. The arrogant patriarch dissolved, leaving behind an old man staring at a ghost. His eyes widened as the disparate pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind. The sabotaging email he sent 3 months ago. The dummy intelligence he eagerly downloaded. The failing algorithms. He realized he had not been fighting a faceless hedge fund. He had been fighting me. Preston noticed the sudden silence and turned around in his chair. When he saw me standing next to the enemy general, his mouth dropped open. He let out a soft, breathless sound of pure confusion. He looked from me to our father and back again, waiting for someone to explain the joke. I did not offer them a greeting. I did not blink or show a shred of hesitation. I walked straight past my father carrying the silver briefcase. I moved to the front of the room and took the empty leather chair directly to the right of Sterling. It was the seat designated for the lead strategist. Sarah took the seat beside me, projecting total authority. My father scrambled to reassemble his fractured composure. He stood up, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction. "David, there must be some kind of administrative error here," my father stammered. His voice was too loud, pitching upward with raw desperation. "This woman is a junior analyst. She is my daughter. She handles back-office paperwork. She has no authority to be in this room during a confidential defense briefing. You need to have security escort her out before we continue." He was trying to shrink me back into the box he had built for me. He was banking on the assumption that Sterling would view me through the same patronizing lens he always had. He was trying to rewrite reality through sheer volume. Sterling did not pick up the phone to call security. He did not even look at my father. He kept his eyes fixed on the blank smart screen mounted on the wall. "Sit down," Richard Sterling commanded. His voice carried the cold, crushing weight of an anvil dropping onto concrete. "The strategy your firm provided is tearing my company apart. Victoria Watson is the only person who accurately predicted this yield inversion. She is running this meeting now." My father opened his mouth to argue, but the icy, furious glare from the board of directors silenced him. The men and women around the table were watching their fortunes burn, and they had zero patience for his fragile ego. He sank slowly back into his chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and sudden terrifying comprehension. The predator finally realized he was the prey. I opened my briefcase and pulled out my slim digital tablet. I connected the encrypted cable to the boardroom console. The massive smart screen covering the front wall illuminated. It did not display glossy charts or optimistic revenue projections. It displayed the raw bleeding numbers of the global market. The red cascading lines representing the evaporating value of the tech client. The visual proof of their failure dominated the room. I stood up. I did not look at my father. He was already neutralized. I focused my entire attention on the golden boy. Preston was staring at the screen, his eyes wide with rising panic. He recognized the layout of the numbers. It was the exact model he had presented to this very board days earlier, promising them impenetrable security. But the math was eating itself alive. I walked around the edge of the table, my heels clicking softly against the floor. I stopped just a few feet away from where my brother sat. The air in the room was thick and breathless. 7 senior executives, a furious chief executive officer, and a cornered patriarch all watched me. "Preston," I said. My voice was clear and level, projecting across the silent room without a hint of tremor. He flinched when I spoke his name. He looked up at me, seeking the familiar lifeline. He was waiting for the older sister to step in and solve the puzzle. He was waiting for me to whisper the answer so he could repeat it and take the credit just like he had done for his entire life. I gestured toward the glowing red screen behind me. "Your debt-to-equity ratios have collapsed," I stated, laying out the facts with clinical precision. "The Tier 2 liquidity reserves you promised would act as a fail-safe have triggered an algorithmic inversion. The market is exploiting a fundamental structural flaw in the amortization schedules you designed." I stepped closer, leaning down slightly so I was directly in his line of sight. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You presented this architecture to the board," I continued. "You signed your name to the risk assessment. You took full credit for the defensive strategy. So please, Preston, explain to your client why the math is failing." The room went entirely still. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Preston opened his mouth. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight collar. He looked at the red numbers cascading down the screen. He looked at Sterling, who was staring at him with unblinking fury, waiting for a justification. He looked at our father, pleading for an intervention, for a distraction, for anything that would save him from the spotlight. But my father was paralyzed. He could not speak because he did not know the math either. He had built his entire career on charm and leverage, relying on ghosts to do the actual work. There were no ghosts left in the machine to save them. Preston turned his desperate, watery gaze back to me. His eyes begged for mercy. He was silently pleading for me to throw him a rope. I stood perfectly upright, holding his gaze with cold, unbroken eye contact. I offered him nothing but silence. The executives of the board leaned forward in their leather chairs, waiting for the golden boy to speak. They were waiting for the brilliant strategist to fix the broken machine. They waited for an answer he simply did not possess. Preston opened his mouth, but the sound died in his throat. He stared at the glowing smart screen where the red numbers of the tech client stock were in a state of free fall. He blinked rapidly, as if the sheer act of closing his eyes might reset the digital display. He shifted his weight in the heavy leather chair, looking down at his manicured hands. The silence in the boardroom stretched, pulling tighter with every passing second. The executives seated around the long oak table stopped breathing. They were waiting for the senior vice president of acquisitions to justify the collapsing architecture he had sold to them just days prior. Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His gray eyes were locked onto my brother. "We are waiting, Preston," Sterling said. His voice was low and dangerous. "You promised this board that the Tier 2 liquidity reserves would insulate our core assets against an aggressive short sell. You told us the math was impenetrable, but the market is currently tearing your models to shreds. Explain the inversion." Preston pulled at the collar of his shirt. He looked at the screen again, trying to decipher the complex algorithms I had woven together in the middle of the night. He searched for a familiar buzzword. He searched for a life raft. "The compression is an expected anomaly." He stammered, his voice thin and trembling. "The synergy of the market variables is just experiencing a temporary correction. We just need to hold our position and allow the bandwidth to stabilize the core assets." Sterling slammed his open palm against the polished wood of the table. The sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Do not insult my intelligence with empty jargon," Sterling barked. "Your bandwidth is costing my company millions of dollars every 10 minutes. My father realized the golden boy was drowning and immediately lunged forward to intervene. He pushed himself out of his chair, forcing a hollow, booming laugh that sounded absurd in the tense environment. He deployed his classic strategy of treating a catastrophic failure like a minor misunderstanding that only he possessed the wisdom to resolve. "David, let us take a breath and step back from the ledge," my father commanded, using his hands to gesture for calm. "We are getting lost in the weeds. The market is volatile today across the entire sector. You cannot blame my firm for macroeconomic shifts. And as for this presentation," he continued, pointing a dismissive finger at me, "you are allowing a junior analyst with a personal grudge to manipulate your board. My daughter is confused, and she is using selective data to create a panic." I did not let him finish his sentence. I tapped the screen of my tablet, advancing the presentation to the next slide. The display behind me shifted from the live market ticker to a stark, high-resolution image of the exact defense models Preston had submitted to the board. "I am not confused, Richard," I stated, keeping my voice flat and clinical. "I am merely literate." The use of his first name struck him like a physical blow. I had never addressed my father by his given name in my entire life. It stripped away his paternal authority and reduced him to nothing more than opposing counsel. He opened his mouth to shout, but the sheer coldness of my delivery froze the words in his chest. I turned my attention to the board of directors. I walked along the edge of the table, making deliberate eye contact with the men and women who held the fate of the company in their hands. "Let us dissect the strategy you purchased," I said, pointing a laser indicator at the top left corner of the projected spreadsheet. "If you look at the primary amortization schedules, you will see a fatal structural flaw. The advisory firm you hired tied your projected revenue to a highly volatile market index, but disguised it as a stable bond yield." I clicked a button on the console. A red circle appeared around the exact line of code where I had planted the poison pill. "When our firm initiated the short sell this morning, we targeted this specific vulnerability," I explained. "Because your defense models were built on fictional liquidity, the algorithms failed to reconcile the dropping asset values against your inflated debt. The failsafe you were promised does not exist. It was never coded into the architecture. The model is currently feeding incorrect data back into the market, artificially accelerating the panic." The room grew so quiet I could hear the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The board members pulled on their reading glasses and leaned closer to their individual monitors. They scrutinized the math. They were seasoned executives who knew how to read a balance sheet, and once I pointed the flashlight into the dark corner, the flaw became glaringly obvious. They realized they had paid millions of dollars for a shield made of paper. A silver-haired woman sitting near Sterling let out a slow, disgusted breath. "They sold us a fabricated defense," she muttered. Sterling turned his sharp gaze toward my father. His expression was a portrait of pure lethal betrayal. "You sat in my office and guaranteed this structure," Sterling said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You told me your son was a visionary." My father was hyperventilating. His chest heaved beneath his bespoke suit. He looked at the red circle on the screen and then looked at Preston. For the first time in his life, he realized the son he had groomed for greatness was an empty vessel. He realized the models were fraudulent, and he had no idea how they had been constructed because he had never bothered to look beneath the surface. Incompetence of this magnitude is staggering. I continued reclaiming the attention of the room. I walked back to the center of the floor, standing directly in front of the smart screen. But a failure this systemic does not occur by accident. It requires a motive. Sarah Caldwell sat perfectly still in her chair, a faint, predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. She knew the execution was about to shift from a professional dismantling to a criminal exposure. I tapped the console again. The presentation bypassed the standard corporate acquisition data. The red graphs and failing algorithms vanished from the screen. They were replaced by a series of stark black and white financial ledgers. They were not the ledgers of the tech firm. They were the internal operating accounts of the boutique advisory firm run by my father. When an advisory firm is retained for a major acquisition, standard protocol requires client capital to be held in a secure, neutral escrow account, I stated, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the room. The golden rule of our industry is that escrow funds are inviolable. They are a sacred trust until the deal clears. I advanced the slide. A magnified image of the tech client escrow routing numbers appeared on the screen, juxtaposed against a series of offshore holding accounts. While conducting authorized due diligence for this hostile takeover, my firm uncovered a secondary ledger, I explained. I traced a recurring algorithmic anomaly hidden within your escrow accounts. I clicked the presenter remote, highlighting specific dates in bright yellow. On October 12th, a fractional percentage of your capital was transferred out of the secure vault. On October 19th, another transfer occurred. On October 26th, a third. These were not administrative fees. They were unauthorized manual withdrawals. The executive stared at the dates. The silver-haired woman adjusted her glasses, her hands beginning to tremble. Sterling gripped the edge of the table so hard, his knuckles turned stark white. I brought up the final trace protocol, linking the shell accounts directly to the primary operating fund of the Watson boutique firm. "The advisory firm you hired is insolvent," I declared, delivering the kill shot with surgical precision. They suffered catastrophic margin failures in the previous fiscal year. To avoid federal bankruptcy, they began commingling your secure escrow funds. They have been illegally siphoning millions of dollars of your capital to mask their own corporate debt. Your wealth manager has been actively robbing you to fund his own survival. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. The focus of my presentation was entirely corporate, cold, and devastating. I did not mention family drama. I did not talk about the decades of emotional neglect, the sabotaging email, or the cruel dinner conversations. I did not need to. Federal financial crimes exposed in high definition were far more lethal than any personal grievance. The facade of the elite boutique firm shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right in front of the board. Sterling slowly turned his head to look at my father. The CEO looked like a man who had just discovered a viper sleeping in his bed. My father did not try to argue. The bluster, the arrogance, the loud, booming voice evaporated. He slumped back into his leather chair, his posture collapsing inward. The bespoke suit looked like a straitjacket. He stared at the dates and the routing numbers projected on the wall. He knew the paper trail was bulletproof. He knew his career, his wealth, and his freedom were gone. He looked at me, staring at the invisible daughter who had just systematically dismantled his entire universe without raising her voice. But the execution was not over. The board was staring at the stolen millions, and I still had to reveal exactly whose digital fingerprints were on the wire transfers. The executives stared at the stark offshore routing numbers projected on the wall. They were men and women who spent their lives calculating risk, but the sheer brazen nature of this theft left them paralyzed. Siphoning capital from a locked escrow account was not a clever accounting trick. It was a federal felony. It was the kind of crime that ended careers and resulted in long prison sentences. I stood at the front of the room holding the digital presenter. I had shown them the missing money. Now I had to show them the architect of the fraud. In the realm of high finance, a crime does not officially exist until you can attach a signature to the ledger. I tapped the glass screen of my tablet. The presentation shifted away from the routing pathways and brought up the scanned copies of the internal bank authorization forms. These were the actual documents used to execute the wire transfers from the tech client vault into the boutique firm operating accounts. I enlarged the first document until the authorization line filled the entire smart screen. The ink was black and bold. The handwriting was a familiar looping scrawl. It was not the signature of my father. The board members leaned closer to their monitors, squinting at the name. A collective murmur of disbelief rippled around the oak table. The name signed on the line authorizing the illegal transfer of $3 million was Preston Watson. I clicked the presenter, advancing to the next slide. Another wire transfer for $2 million, signed by Preston Watson. I clicked again and again. Document after document flashed across the screen. Every single fraudulent transaction, every stolen dollar utilized to prop up the failing boutique firm, bore the exact same signature. The digital fingerprints belonged exclusively to the senior vice president of acquisitions. I turned my gaze toward my brother. Preston was staring at his own signature magnified on the wall. His face was devoid of color, looking like chalk under the harsh fluorescent lighting. His lips parted, but he could not draw enough air into his lungs to speak. The psychological impact of the revelation hit him with the force of a freight train. I remembered a humid afternoon in July, when Preston was 19 years old. We were sitting on the back patio of our childhood home. My father had walked outside carrying a stack of thick legal documents for a newly formed shell company. He dropped a pen onto the glass table and told Preston to sign on the dotted lines. My brother had asked what the papers were for. My father had smiled his signature charming smile and told him not to worry about the fine print. He told Preston that true leaders delegate the details and trust their partners. Preston had signed every page without reading a single word, proud to be included in the grown-up business. My father had been grooming him since that day. He had spent years conditioning his golden boy to blindly trust his authority. He taught Preston to trade basic due diligence for unearned praise and fancy titles. I had always assumed my father gave Preston the executive position out of blind nepotism. I was wrong. The promotion was a calculated, premeditated snare. My father knew his firm was rotting from the inside. He knew the debt would eventually consume them. He needed a legal shield. He positioned his own son directly under the heavy chandelier and handed him the rope, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. Preston slowly turned his head to look at our father. The hero worship that had defined their entire relationship shattered in an instant. The golden boy saw the patriarch for exactly what he was. A terrified, selfish man who was willing to send his own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary just to avoid the consequences of his own greed. "Why is my name on these?" Preston whispered. His voice was fragile and broken. "You told me those were standard compliance forms. You told me the legal team had already vetted them." My father could not look his son in the eye. He stared down at his own hands resting on the oak table. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse to spin another web of lies, but there was no room left for deception. The undeniable proof was glowing on the wall. His silence was the ultimate confession. He had sacrificed his son to save his own skin. Preston slumped back in his chair. The unearned arrogance, the entitlement, the illusion of brilliance all drained away, leaving behind a terrified 26-year-old boy facing federal fraud charges. He was the fall guy. He had traded his freedom for a corner office and a leased sports car. David Sterling stood up. The chief executive officer did not shout. Men who wield genuine power rarely need to raise their voices. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket and looked down at my father with an expression of pure surgical disgust. "Richard Watson, your services are terminated effective immediately," Sterling said. The words fell like stones onto a glass floor. "Your firm no longer represents this company in any capacity. You will vacate your access to our servers by noon." My father jerked his head up. "David, wait!" he pleaded, holding out a trembling hand. "We can structure a settlement. We can replace the capital. I can fix this. You cannot fix federal fraud." Richard Sterling interrupted, his tone devoid of any mercy. "My legal team is drafting a formal referral right now. By the end of the business day, I am handing this entire dossier, including every forged ledger and unauthorized transfer, directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You have stolen from my board, and you have attempted to leave your own son holding the bag. I will see you in federal court." The threat of the Regulatory Commission was the final nail in the coffin. The SEC did not negotiate. They would freeze his assets, seize his properties, and strip his licenses before the end of the week. The Watson legacy was dead. Sterling turned his attention away from the ruined men and looked at his board of directors. The righteous fury faded, replaced by the grim reality of their current situation. Their advisory firm was terminated. Their escrow accounts were depleted. Their defense models were a laughingstock. And out on the trading floor, the market was currently devouring their stock price. They were a bleeding ship surrounded by sharks. Sarah Caldwell recognized the exact moment the prey realized they had no options left. She stood up from her chair, her movements smooth and calculated. She was the apex predator, sensing the open throat. She unclasped her sleek leather briefcase and withdrew a single pristine folder. She slid it across the long oak table until it came to rest directly in front of Sterling. "Your company is exposed, David," Sarah said, her voice calm and authoritative. "The market is going to continue punishing your stock until there is nothing left to salvage. You have no defense strategy, and your liquidity is compromised. But my firm does not want to see a valuable asset destroyed by the incompetence of a corrupt wealth manager." Sterling looked at the leather folder and then up at Sarah. "What is this?" he asked. "That is a formal buyout offer," Sarah replied. "We are offering a 10% premium over your current plummeting share price. We will absorb your debt, stabilize your core assets, and secure your supply chain. We will stop the bleeding immediately. But the offer is only valid for the next 60 minutes. If you walk out of this room without signing, we withdraw the term sheet and let the market finish the job." It was a ruthless, brilliant maneuver. She had orchestrated the panic, exposed the corruption, and then offered the only available life raft. She was charging them a fortune for the privilege of surviving the crisis she helped create. Sterling opened the folder. He read the terms in silence. He looked at the red numbers still cascading down the smart screen. He looked at the terrified faces of his board members. They were cornered. There was no alternative strategy to pivot toward. They needed the vast resources of Sarah Caldwell to shield them from the storm. Sterling pulled a silver pen from his inside pocket. He did not ask for a vote. He did not debate the margins. He uncapped the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the term sheet. The hostile takeover was officially complete. Sarah accepted the signed document and placed it back into her briefcase. The transaction was cold and efficient. I disconnected my tablet from the console, and the smart screen went dark, erasing the red numbers and the fraudulent signatures from the room. The board members stood up, gathering their belongings in stunned silence. They filed out of the glass doors, eager to escape the suffocating tension of the boardroom. Sterling followed them without a backward glance. Within 2 minutes, the room was empty. Only 3 people remained sitting in the quiet aftermath: the predator, the architect, and the ruins of the Watson family. The battle was over, and the leverage had entirely reversed. It was time for the final accounting. Gemini and I. The heavy glass doors glided shut, sealing the 3 of us inside the executive boardroom. The departure of the tech executives left behind a vacuum. For my entire life, the presence of my father had consumed whatever room he occupied. He dictated the temperature, the volume, the emotional weather. He was a man who filled spaces with his booming laugh and his unyielding demands. Now he was a hollow shell sitting at a polished oak table. The storm outside continued to batter the windows, throwing distorted gray shadows across his face. I stood near the presentation console, packing my digital tablet into my briefcase. I did not rush. Every click of the metal latches echoed in the silent space, marking the end of an era. Preston remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the dark smart screen. He looked like a survivor pulling himself from the wreckage of a car crash, only to realize he was the one who cut the brake lines. My brother finally moved. He turned his head slowly, dragging his gaze away from the wall and fixing it on the man sitting next to him. Growing up, Preston had never faced a single penalty. When he shattered a greenhouse with a baseball, our father wrote a check before the glass even finished falling. When he was caught plagiarizing a college thesis, our father made a generous donation to the university alumni fund. The lesson was ingrained deep in his bones: wealth erased consequences. But the Securities and Exchange Commission did not accept alumni donations. Dad, Preston whispered, his voice cracking. The sound was thin and pathetic. "Tell me you have a plan. Tell me you are going to call the lawyers and fix this. You always fix this." My father did not answer. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, rubbing them as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. He dragged his palms down his face, leaving his skin flushed and slick with sweat. The silence stretched. The realization hit Preston with fresh, agonizing force. There was no checkbook big enough to buy their way out of a federal indictment. The patriarch had nothing left to offer. The golden boy realized the pedestal he had been standing on was actually a scaffold. Richard dropped his hands and looked at me. The transition was jarring. The condescending sneer he had worn since my childhood vanished. He pushed himself up from the table, his legs unsteady. He stumbled forward, closing the distance between us. I did not step back. I held my ground, watching him approach. He stopped a few feet away. His bespoke suit was wrinkled, his tie askew. The smell of stale coffee and pure primal panic radiated from him. "Victoria," he started. His tone was unrecognizable. It was the frantic, reedy pitch of a beggar. "You cannot let Sterling hand that dossier to the federal regulators. You know what they will do to us. They will freeze the operating accounts. They will seize the house in Connecticut. They will send your brother to prison." I closed the lid of my briefcase, locking it with a sharp snap. He did not say they will send me to prison. Even in the depths of his ruin, he was still trying to use Preston as a human shield. He was still trying to weaponize my empathy for the golden boy to save his own skin. "You work for Sarah Caldwell now," he continued, his words spilling out in a desperate, rushing current. "She values your input. She just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar acquisition because of your strategy. You have leverage. You can talk to her. Tell her to make the escrow evidence part of a sealed non-disclosure agreement. Tell her to bury the paper trail as a condition of the buyout. We can quietly repay the stolen capital over the next 5 years. No one has to go to jail." He reached out as if to grab my arm, but something in my posture made him drop his hand. He resorted to a different tactic. He tried to invoke the ghost of our shared history. "Your mother will not survive the scandal," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If the feds raid the house, it will destroy her. You are her daughter. We are blood, Victoria. Family protects family. You cannot just stand there and watch us burn. You have to save us. Family protects family." The phrase hung in the cold air of the boardroom. It was a fascinating choice of words. I thought about the holidays spent sitting at the far end of the dining table, listening to him mock my state university degree. I thought about the endless string of administrative jobs he suggested I pursue to keep me out of the real financial arena. I thought about the 80-hour work weeks I endured, just trying to build a foundation he could not tear down. He had spent 28 years treating me like an inconvenient accessory. He only invoked the concept of family when he needed a hostage. I looked at his desperate, sweating face. I felt no urge to yell. The anger that had fueled my late-night study sessions and my grueling corporate climb had burned itself out, leaving behind a cool ash. I did not hate him. Hating someone required an emotional investment I was no longer willing to make. His panic was just a data point. His begging was just noise. I unzipped the front pocket of my leather portfolio. I reached inside and felt the crisp edges of a single sheet of paper. I had carried it with me every single day for 3 months. It had been my fuel, my shield, and my silent companion through endless nights of modeling financial algorithms. I withdrew the page and held it between my index finger and thumb. I held it out to him. My father looked at the paper. His trembling hand reached out and took it. The sheet shook visibly in his grip. He looked down at the printed text. It was the private email he had sent to Sarah Caldwell on the week of my initial interview. He read his own words. He saw the exact sentences where he tried to assassinate my character and ensure I remained dependent on his scraps. He saw the exact mechanism that had triggered his own execution. The air seemed to leave his lungs in one long, ragged exhale. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with the realization that he had handed me the knife I just used to cut his throat. The arrogance, the manipulation, the lifelong campaign to keep me small, it had all culminated in this single piece of paper. He had engineered his own destruction. I picked up my briefcase by the leather handle. The metal latches gleamed in the dim light. I smoothed the front of my blazer and met his gaze one final time. "I would love to help you structure a legal defense, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The words echoed off the glass walls, crisp and final. "But as you warned my boss, I am easily overwhelmed by complex tasks." I did not wait for his response. I did not look at Preston, who was now sobbing quietly into his hands. I turned on my heel and walked toward the double doors. I pushed them open and stepped out into the pristine marble reception area. I left them sitting in the dark boardroom, holding the evidence of their own hubris. The clicking of my heels faded as the elevator doors closed behind me, severing the tie forever. 6 months vanished in a blur of depositions, subpoenas, and market realignments. The federal government does not operate with anger or theatrical boardroom speeches. It operates with a cold, bureaucratic precision that is far more terrifying to a man who has spent his entire life believing he is untouchable. The Securities and Exchange Commission descended on the boutique firm 48 hours after our meeting. They arrived in dark, unmarked sedans carrying empty cardboard boxes and digital extraction drives. They walked past the receptionist without speaking and began dismantling the servers. They stripped Richard Watson of his financial licenses with a single stamped document handed to him in the hallway of his own office. They froze his operating accounts, his personal checking, and the offshore routing hubs. The bank seized the sprawling colonial house in Connecticut, changing the locks while my parents stood on the manicured lawn. I read the summary of the liquidation in an industry newsletter while drinking my morning espresso at my new desk. My father went from a man who commanded prime tables at Manhattan steakhouses to a defendant relying on an overworked public defender because his retained counsel dropped him the moment the retainer check bounced. His vintage golf clubs and tailored suits were auctioned off to pay a fraction of his civil penalties. The legacy he obsessed over was reduced to a cautionary tale, whispered by junior analysts during their lunch breaks. But the most poetic justice belonged to the golden boy. Preston spent his entire life coasting on the assumption of safety, wrapped in a cocoon of unearned privilege. When the federal investigators placed him in a sterile, windowless interrogation room, the illusion evaporated. I can picture the scene perfectly. A federal prosecutor sliding the wire transfers across a cold metal table, tapping a pen against the fraudulent signatures. They offered him a stark choice: face 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, or testify against the architect of the scheme. Faced with the prospect of wearing an orange jumpsuit, the fierce loyalty my father had cultivated shattered into dust. Preston turned state's evidence before the ink on his indictment was even dry. He handed the prosecutors every hidden ledger, every deleted email, and every verbal directive our father had ever given him. He traded his bloodline for a plea deal. He avoided prison, but he was permanently banned from the financial sector. I heard through the grapevine that the former senior vice president of acquisitions is now living in a cramped studio apartment in Ohio. He works an entry-level customer service job, answering phones in a gray cubicle under buzzing fluorescent lights for $12 an hour. He endures screaming customers and rigid break schedules. He finally has to earn his keep in the real world without a safety net to catch his failures. The fallout did not stop at the courthouse steps. It seeped into the remaining cracks of the family foundation, twisting the survivors into desperate versions of themselves. Yesterday evening, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the kitchen island in my new home. My phone vibrated against the marble countertop. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, the digital transcript generated on my screen. It was my mother. I tapped the play icon and listened to the audio. Her voice was shrill and frantic, devoid of the practiced country club elegance she usually projected. She was crying a wet, gasping sound that used to make me drop whatever I was doing to comfort her. She told me the legal fees were drowning them. She said my father was facing an upcoming trial date, and they could not afford a decent defense attorney. Then the grief twisted into familiar venomous manipulation. She demanded I wire them a portion of my new corporate salary. She said I owed them for raising me, for putting a roof over my head, for feeding me. She claimed it was my fault the firm went under because I did not protect them in that boardroom when I had the chance. She called me ungrateful. I listened to the entire 2-minute recording. I heard the desperation of an enabler who had lost her kingdom and was looking for a new subject to drain. In the past, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of guilt. I would have drained my savings to rescue her, trading my security for a fleeting moment of her approval. Now the recording just sounded like static on a broken radio. I did not text her back. I did not wire a single dime. I felt the cool glass of the wine stem in my hand and recognized the profound silence in my own chest. I tapped the screen and deleted the voicemail. Then I opened her contact profile and blocked the number. I performed the same action for her email address, her social media accounts, and any secondary numbers associated with their new rented condo. I erased the final tether tying me to the Watson name. The severance was physical and profound. I set the phone down and took a deep breath of the quiet air. I walked out of the pristine kitchen and stepped into the sprawling living room of my new residence. I had moved out of the cramped, noisy Brooklyn apartment 3 months ago. I now owned a luxury penthouse in a towering glass high-rise in Tribeca. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The city stretched out before me, a glittering grid of light ambition and endless capital. I stood on the polished hardwood floor, looking down at the streets where I used to ride the subway running on fumes and the fear of failure. I had purchased this sanctuary with my own money, earned through my own intellect and strategic execution. The furnishings were minimal and modern, chosen by me for my own comfort. I was no longer the invisible daughter fetching coffee or ghostwriting spreadsheets in the shadows. I was a senior vice president of strategy. I had claimed my autonomy and locked the door behind me. I took a sip of the vintage wine, savoring the taste of victory. I had survived the toxic sabotage and turned it into an empire. I had played the corporate game and won the ultimate prize. But the game was deeper and far more intricate than I realized. As I stood watching the lights of the financial district reflect against the glass, my phone vibrated one more time. It was a calendar alert, a reminder for a celebratory dinner scheduled for tomorrow night with Sarah Caldwell. We were marking the 1-year anniversary of my hiring and the record-breaking quarter our firm just posted. I smiled, anticipating a quiet evening of industry gossip and expensive scotch. I had no idea that Sarah was preparing to pull back the curtain on the final hidden layer of the board. The hostile takeover had been a masterpiece, but I was about to learn the terrifying truth about the day she first read that email from my father. Exactly 1 year had passed since the morning the federal regulators marched into the lobby of my father's firm. The anniversary arrived on a crisp Friday evening in late autumn. Sarah Caldwell and I sat in a secluded corner of an exclusive rooftop lounge in the Chelsea district. The environment was a sanctuary for the elite of the city, featuring low velvet seating, roaring gas fire pits, and the faint, sophisticated pulse of a jazz trio playing in the background. We were insulated from the noise of the streets below. We had every reason to celebrate. Our firm had just closed the fiscal calendar and posted the highest quarterly earnings in its history. I wore a tailored silk blazer and drank a vintage single malt scotch that tasted like smoke and old money. Sarah sat across from me holding her own crystal glass. She did not look like a corporate executive winding down after a grueling week. She possessed the quiet, unblinking stillness of a grandmaster, studying a chessboard long after the opponent had resigned the match. She swirled the amber liquid, watching the heavy drops cling to the inside of the glass. The firelight cast sharp shadows across her face. "You have navigated this year with remarkable precision, Victoria," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "Your strategic instincts during the last 3 mergers have been flawless. You have proven that you belong at the highest tier of this industry." I smiled and took a slow sip of my drink. "I learned from the best," I replied. "You handed me the playbook on my first day. You gave me the tools to dismantle the people who tried to keep me invisible." Sarah stopped swirling her glass. She set it down on the low marble table separating us. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. Her expression shifted from relaxed camaraderie to a sharp, calculating intensity. "There is something I never told you about your first day," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a lower register. "Something about the day I received the email from your father." I kept my gaze steady, but a faint spark of curiosity ignited in my chest. I remembered the email vividly. The printed page calling me easily overwhelmed and not bright enough to handle the pressure. It was the catalyst for my entire awakening. I assumed she had kept it simply to test my resilience, to see if the cruelty of my father would break me or forge me into a weapon. "I told you I hired you because of that email," Sarah continued. "I told you I recognized the hunger of a daughter underestimated by an arrogant patriarch." That was true. But it was only a fraction of the truth. I did not just see a motivated analyst when I read those words. I saw a glaring neon sign pointing toward a fatal vulnerability. She picked up her drink again, but did not take a sip. "In the realm of high finance, arrogance is a standard operating procedure," she explained. "Hubris is common, but sheer profound stupidity is rare. When a managing director of a boutique firm is foolish enough to put a deliberate sabotage attempt of his own blood relative into writing and send it to a rival vice president on a monitored corporate server, it tells me everything I need to know about his internal risk assessment. It told me Richard Watson possessed a blind spot the size of a skyscraper." I listened intently, absorbing the cold, structural logic of her assessment. "A man that blinded by his own ego is a man hiding secrets," Sarah said. "Healthy, solvent executives do not spend their time trying to sabotage junior analysts. They do not care. The only reason a man of his supposed stature would go out of his way to blindfold his own daughter is because he is terrified of what she might see if she opens her eyes." The day I read that email, I knew his firm was rotting from the inside out. I knew his ledgers were compromised. I set my glass down next to hers. "Are you saying you knew about the escrow embezzlement before I even uncovered it?" I asked, my voice remaining level despite the sudden shifting of the ground beneath my feet. "I did not know the specific mechanics of his fraud," Sarah clarified, "but I knew the disease was there. I just needed the right operative to diagnose it and cut it out. You were the perfect surgical instrument." She leaned back in her velvet chair, letting the ambient light from the city wash over her features. "The hostile takeover of the tech client was never my primary objective," Sarah revealed, delivering the truth with surgical precision. "The tech client was a mid-tier operation with stagnant growth metrics. We spent millions acquiring them, but they were just a decoy. They were a shiny object dangled over a hidden trap." My mind raced, tracing the timeline of the past year. The dummy intelligence, the planted trap errors, the engineered panic on the trading floor. I initiated the strike against the tech client, Because I knew your father was their primary defense counsel, Sarah continued. I knew he was desperate. I knew that if we applied enough pressure to his premier account, he would panic and make reckless, illegal mistakes to defend his remaining illusion of status. The tech client was just a smokescreen. My true prize was forcing his boutique firm into federal bankruptcy. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a heavy metallic finality. My father had built a boutique empire holding prime legacy contracts, undervalued intellectual property, and premium commercial real estate leases. But those assets were locked behind his corrupt management. The only way to extract the true value of his firm was to force a liquidation. When the Regulatory Commission raided his office and seized his operating accounts, they put his firm into receivership. Sarah said, her eyes gleaming with predatory triumph. During the closed-door bankruptcy auctions over the last 6 months, my parent company swooped in. We purchased his prime distressed assets, his patents, and his pristine commercial leases for pennies on the dollar. We acquired a portfolio worth tens of millions by triggering the collapse of a man who thought he was untouchable. I stared at her, the profound depth of her orchestration washing over me. I had believed I was the architect of the hostile takeover. I had believed I was driving the vehicle of my own vengeance. But Sarah had built the road, designed the vehicle, and handed me the keys knowing exactly where I would crash it. You used me as bait, I stated, outlining the reality without a trace of bitterness. I used you as the bait, the executioner, and the victor. Sarah corrected, her tone ringing with genuine respect. I needed a strategist who understood his specific psychological flaws. I needed an operative who could trigger his paranoia and lead him into the snare. You weaponized your intellect, and I weaponized the entire narrative. We monetized your trauma, Victoria. I did not feel angry. I did not feel manipulated. Sitting on the rooftop, looking at the brilliant, ruthless woman across from me, I felt a profound sense of awe. I had spent my childhood serving an insecure man who operated on bluster and intimidation. Now, I was standing beside a true titan who moved entire markets without raising her voice. Sarah reached into the sleek leather portfolio resting beside her chair. She withdrew a thick, crisp envelope and placed it on the marble table between us. I opened the envelope. Inside was a bound legal document. The heading at the top of the page read, Formal Partnership Agreement. I flipped to the second page, outlining the compensation structure. The base salary was staggering, but the signing bonus printed in bold ink was astronomical. It was a 7-figure sum that guaranteed I would never have to worry about financial security for the rest of my natural life. It is a generous offer, I said, tracing the embossed seal at the bottom of the page. It is exactly what you earned, Sarah replied. But you should know the origin of that specific signing bonus. When the federal courts liquidated the personal portfolio of Richard Watson to cover his civil penalties, they auctioned off his vintage car collection, his country club shares, and the remaining equity from his seized estate. My firm purchased those specific assets, liquidated them through private channels, and routed the clean capital directly into our executive compensation fund. She offered a slow, chilling smile. Your father spent your entire life trying to keep you in the basement, Sarah said. I thought it was only fitting that the remnants of his shattered ego pay for your elevation to the penthouse. He funded your partnership. A quiet laugh escaped my lips, rising into the cold night air. The justice was so poetic it bordered on the divine. My father had tried to starve me out of the industry, and instead he had inadvertently purchased my crown. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my favorite silver pen. The metal felt heavy and warm in my grip. I did not hesitate to read the fine print. I knew exactly who I was doing business with. I pressed the pen to the signature line and signed my name with a smooth, sweeping stroke. I handed the document back to Sarah. She tucked it into her portfolio and raised her crystal glass of scotch. I raised mine to meet it. The glasses chimed together, a clear ringing sound that carried over the low hum of the city. I turned my head and looked out over the sprawling grid of Manhattan. The towering skyscrapers glowed against the dark sky monuments to power and resilience. The invisible daughter who used to fetch coffee and crave the validation of a toxic family was a ghost, a faded memory left behind in a dark Brooklyn apartment. I was Victoria Watson, a partner at the most ruthless firm in the financial district. I had taken the weapons used against me and forged an empire of my own. The city stretched out before me, infinite and waiting, and for the first time in my life, I owned the view.
The dust has finally settled on the Watson empire. The boardroom is empty, the federal indictments have been filed, and the sprawling Connecticut estate has been auctioned off to the highest bidder. On the surface, the story of Victoria Watson and the spectacular, systematic dismantling of her father's boutique advisory firm reads like a masterclass in corporate warfare. It is a thrilling, high-stakes saga of hostile takeovers, leverage, and ultimate vengeance. But when you strip away the designer suits, the staggering bank accounts, and the glass-walled skyscrapers, what remains is not a story about Wall Street at all. It is a deeply intimate, chilling, cautionary tale about the American living room. When we look closely at the ruins of the Watson family, we are forced to confront the darkest corners of parenting. In American culture, where individualism, self-reliance, and meritocracy are held up as the highest societal virtues, the family remains the essential crucible where these traits are either forged or destroyed. The tragedy of Richard Watson was not his financial insolvency. It was his profound moral bankruptcy as a father. His downfall offers every parent a stark, uncomfortable mirror reflecting the true weight of our family responsibilities, the necessity of emotional awareness, and the lifelong consequences of the guidance we choose to provide or withhold. At the very heart of the Watson family's collapse is the devastating psychological phenomena of the golden child and the invisible child. It is a dynamic born of a parent's failure to practice fairness and emotional honesty. Richard Watson looked at his son Preston and decided to build him a gilded cage. In a misguided attempt to secure a legacy, Richard handed his son prestigious titles, luxury cars, and unearned praise. He gave Preston the finish line without ever requiring him to run the race. As parents, our instinct is often to protect our children from hardship, to pave their roads and cushion their falls. But handing a child the rewards of success without demanding the grueling character-building work required to achieve it is not an act of love. It is an act of profound cruelty. Preston was raised with an illusion of invincibility, completely devoid of the coping mechanisms and practical skills required to survive in the real world. When the storm came, he had no foundation. He was crushed by the very privilege his father thought would protect him. Conversely, Victoria was cast into the shadows. Relegated to the role of the invisible child, she was expected to be the quiet, disposable engine fueling her brother's ascent. When parents assign rigid, limiting roles to their children, they commit a grave emotional injustice. They strip the child of their inherent right to be seen, validated, and nurtured. If an overlooked child is resilient enough as Victoria was, they will survive. But they will weaponize their trauma. They will take the coldness they were raised in and forge it into a sword, ultimately severing the familial tie entirely. A traditional family structure cannot survive if the foundation is built on blatant inequality. Fairness is not just a moral ideal, it is the mortar that keeps the bricks of a family from crumbling. Perhaps the most haunting element of the Watson saga is the email. The moment Richard Watson typed the words, "She is a good girl, but not that bright," he committed the ultimate betrayal. A parent's voice does not merely guide a child, it becomes their inner monologue. Words possess a terrifying power. When a parent dismisses, belittles, or boxes a child in those labels, stick like tar to the child's psyche. Emotional awareness in parenting means understanding that our offhand comments, our sighs of disappointment, and our dismissive critiques shape the architecture of our children's self-worth. We must be fiercely protective of how we speak about our children's potential. To limit a child's horizon simply because they do not fit the mold we envisioned is a failure of both imagination and parental duty. Furthermore, the Watson story forces us to redefine what we mean by traditional family values. Throughout the narrative, Richard Watson wields the phrase, "family protects family," like a loaded weapon. He attempts to use the concept of familial loyalty as a hostage negotiation tactic to cover up his own toxic, illegal behavior. In a healthy, traditional family, loyalty is indeed a core value, but true loyalty cannot be demanded through guilt, nor can it be written into a contract of complicity. Real familial loyalty is organic. It is earned through decades of mutual respect, unconditional love, and unyielding honesty. You cannot demand that a child honor the family name if you have spent their entire life dishonoring their spirit. We must teach our children that family is a sanctuary of truth, not a shield for deceit. Honesty within the home, admitting when we as parents are wrong, holding ourselves accountable and treating our children with transparent respect is the only way to build a family unit that can withstand the pressures of the outside world. Ultimately, the goal of raising a child in today's fast-paced, cutthroat society is to grant them autonomy. We are not raising children to be extensions of our own egos, nor are we raising them to fulfill the dreams we abandoned. We are raising them to leave us. A successful parent prepares their child to step out of the front door and navigate the complexities of life with integrity and strength. We must give them wings to fly, rather than the gilded cage of unearned entitlement or the heavy chains of constant belittlement. We must let them fail, let them feel the sting of consequence, and let them learn to stand back up on their own 2 feet. If you find yourself reflecting deeply on these dynamics, examining the silent currents running through your own living room, you are not alone. Family is the most beautiful, complicated story any of us will ever be a part of. To explore more narratives that look beneath the surface of human relationships, psychology, and the hidden truths of our lives, be sure to follow the channel Eva Tells Stories. There is always another layer to uncover and another lesson waiting in the dark. The greatest legacy a parent leaves behind is not a thriving corporation, a sprawling estate, or a prominent family name carved into a brass plaque. The true legacy is the quiet, unbreakable integrity of a child who knows exactly who they are because they were raised in a home that allowed them to be real. Think about the quiet moments in your own home tonight. When the lights are dimmed and the house settles into silence, look down the hallway toward the rooms where your children sleep, or think of them out in the world building lives of their own. Ask yourself what echoes you have left in their minds. Did you build them a sanctuary of fairness and truth? Did you give them the tools to weather the storm, or did you accidentally teach them how to summon the rain? The answer isn't always clear, and perhaps it is never truly finished. We are all just shaping the clay, hoping that when the fire comes, what we have built will be strong enough to survive the heat.